Ladies and gentlemen, please. Thank you to take your seats. And welcome to this high panel discussion, Your Excellencies, the Special Representative, Ministers. Just a few practical information. You have translation in French and English and other languages available with your headphones. We're going to start with two opening words from Minister Abela, that we thank for receiving us here at the United Nations, followed by Ms. Louise Arbour as a Special Representative on International Migration of the Secretary General. And then we'll have a panel discussion, and Ms. Arbour has just informed us that she will be able to stay with us at the beginning of this panel discussion with our distinguished guests from ICMP. I'll take them in order of seats: ICMPD, France, obviously Malta, the Republic of Malta. We have His Excellency the Foreign Minister of the Republic of Tunisia, the EU delegation represented here as well, and Francesco Rocca from the International Red Cross Federation. So please, Mr. Minister, the floor is yours with your introductory statement.
Good morning to everyone. Dear colleague, Minister Jhinaoui, UN Special Representative for International Migration, Excellencies, distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen. I'm honored to welcome you to this high-level panel debate in which Malta has joined forces with Tunisia, France, the European Commission, and the International Center for Migration Policy Development. Today we have an opportunity to reflect on the opportunities offered to us by a more balanced narrative on migration and the media's role in shaping public attitudes vis-à-vis this issue. Notwithstanding the fact that human mobility has been a global phenomenon throughout human history, it remains a contentious and polarizing issue, particularly when it is irregular as opposed to legal migration. It raises a multitude of emotions, of compassion, of empathy, and of humanity, but also negative ones of prejudice, intolerance, and fear of being taken over by a Trojan horse or of losing one's identity, control, safety, and jobs, amongst others. Of course, having an agreed framework for legal migration, coupled with genuine efforts for integration in the host societies, is the ideal way forward. Yet it is a fact that we are still facing a reality of frequent, irregular arrivals that need to be managed, keeping in mind that we are dealing with human beings and not statistics. Fear of migrants and refugees must be acknowledged and taken seriously, but countered by messages that combat myths and explain migrants' contribution to our social and economic development. Counter-narrative campaigns, be they at the national or supranational levels, go a good way to allay fears and prejudice. However, such campaigns on their own are never enough. For countries like my country, Malta, those present here today and other frontline states that are most exposed, mass migration is a challenge. However, we are all aware that with challenges come opportunities. Long-term opportunities are difficult to communicate in the light of highly visible short-term costs. In this regard, there is an urgent need to allow our perception on migration to evolve into a more holistic one. And there is no better way of doing so than through the media, as the media have a crucial role in the shaping of public opinions and attitudes. In today's day and age, tragedies get more likes and views. As the saying goes, if it bleeds, it leads. More than ever before, there is a dire need to rebalance the narrative on migration by promoting and rewarding journalistic excellence in covering migration. This does not mean that the responsibility lies exclusively with the media. Politicians and others have a very important role to play in this matter too. A well-documented and balanced narrative would facilitate evidence-based migration policy development and implementation. Towards this end, about 2 weeks ago, the second edition of the Migration Media Award was held in Tunisia. The first edition was held in Malta in June 2017. The award's objective is similar to these side events, which is to encourage and reward journalistic excellence on migration matters in the Euro-Mediterranean region. We need to see more high-quality journalistic works that delve into the subject and present a comprehensive picture on migration. It is important that more journalists dare go beyond the sensational and emergency scenarios and help the community discover the reality of common life as a migrant. It is essential to debunk the myths on migration. Today's high-level panel is the start of the exploration of other similar initiatives, such as this, to engage the media in rebalancing the migration narrative. This would facilitate the development and implementation of migration policies that are evidence-based, which in turn produces more equitable outcomes for all stakeholders, including the migrant themselves. I thank you for your attention.
Thank you, Minister. Thank you, Minister, for setting the stage for this panel, which is indeed about giving voice to evidence. I would like now to call to the floor Ms. Louise Arbour. The same as Mr. Abela's first public event was in Malta, was to host the Migration Media Award. Ms. Arbour then, for this first edition, gave us a tremendous and inspiring video message pointing out the need and the responsibilities of journalists in actually fostering new narratives and helping change this perception. Perception is, as the issue itself, complex. And I'm pretty sure that Ms. Arbour will enlighten us further here. Thank you so much. You can stay in your seat if you want, so that your colleagues can see you. Whichever. Unless you want the floor. Oh.
Thank you. Requires some adjustment. Thank you very much. Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, dear colleagues, partners, I always wonder whether you see me as well, whether I'm standing or sitting. Doesn't seem to make very much difference. Allow me to express my thanks first to the governments of France, Malta, Tunisia, the European Union, and ICMPD for organizing today's event and for giving me an opportunity to give you these opening remarks. I'm very happy to be with you today. This event provides us with an opportunity to underscore the importance of having a fact-based narrative on migration. Unfortunately, as we know, we've witnessed in the recent past an alarming growth in negative and inaccurate perceptions of migrants as either burdens or threats in some countries. And unfortunately, some of these perceptions have started to move from the fringes to the mainstream, impacting dinner table conversations and actually turning national elections. This makes the adoption of the Global Compact for Safe, Orderly and Regular Migration in December this year in Marrakesh all the more significant. After months of consultations, stock-taking and negotiations, the majority of member states of the United Nations have agreed to the first ever international framework to improve cooperation on migration. The compact represents a significant achievement of multilateralism. Despite the compact being non-legally binding, it certainly has enormous political and moral weight, since member states have agreed on the need to improve the management of human mobility, really for the first time in the history of the United Nations. And while it serves as a reaffirmation of state sovereignty in matters of border control, which I think it's important to stress, the compact also reflects the inevitable interdependence of states and the value of a collaborative framework on an issue that affects all countries and all people. An important aspect of the Global Compact is the promotion, and I use the language of the Compact, of an open and evidence-based public discourse on migration and migrants that generates more realistic, humane, and constructive perception. This is necessary to correct the proliferating negative perceptions of migrants. And indeed, the Global Compact does recognize the complexity of migration, its inevitability, the multitude of factors that trigger individual decisions of people to relocate, and the variety of circumstances under which people eventually settle in host communities. The Global Compact is the culmination of decades' worth of studies, research, dialogues, and debates, acknowledging the many benefits that migration brings to states, to host communities, to migrants, and to the people they leave behind, despite the obvious stretches, setbacks, and stresses that migration inevitably also creates at times. I just want to give you maybe two quick examples of the well-documented positive benefits of migration that are very often overlooked in public debate, where the focus is very often on, as has been mentioned before, very dramatic circumstances that do not reflect the reality of most migrants. Migrant workers in higher productivity settings have contributed 6.7 trillion or 9.4% to the global GDP in 2015, and this represents 3 trillion more than they would have had they remained in their country of origin. Another, I think, important factor that it's important to bring back even to national conversations about global migration. Through the 15% of their income that migrants on average sent back to their home countries in the form of remittances, in 2017, nearly $600 billion was remitted internationally, 3 times greater than the total of official development aid that richer countries sent to the developing world. And approximately 450 billion of this was actually sent to developing countries. And of course, the 85% of their earnings that migrants actually spend in their host communities is spent in the form of taxes and all forms of spendings that actually contribute to the local economy. There are, of course, those instances when international migration can have negative impacts. For example, when large inflows of migrants have a short-term destabilizing effects on local labor markets, particularly if they're not properly regulated, or when large numbers of skilled migrants leave a country to seek work elsewhere, thereby creating labor gaps that may be very difficult to fill. This is often reflected in the expression brain drain, which can easily be turned into brain gain if we have proper practices in place. But over the long term, the evidence is very clear. The benefits of migration, and I stress the benefits of well-managed migration, vastly outweigh the challenges. Migration brings with it prosperity, innovation, and progress. It is a potent motor of development, and needless to say, it is a life-changing experience for generations, migrants and host communities alike. Sometimes, though, even the most persuasive facts-based arguments related to the management of human mobility cannot compete successfully with deeply held concerns about migration's cultural and social impacts. Despite the economic evidence, there continues to be some wariness, if not outright resentment, towards migrants in many parts of the world. A toxic combination of suspicion and even fear of foreigners coming to take away jobs, commit crime, or abuse the welfare system, often permeates the public debate about migration. It's very difficult to respond to the nostalgia for a happier way of life that migrants are assumed to be threatening. For every community welcoming migrants, unfortunately, there are others who respond with great skepticism. We must recognize that different countries and different communities within a given country will have different perspectives on migration. They will have had different experiences, as well as, at any given time, different priorities and different challenges. Both domestically and globally, these concerns should not be dismissed offhand, but rather I think they should be addressed even if, and I stress, particularly if they are misguided. It's not useful, in my view, to position a debate as being either for or against migration. And it's not unreasonable to have concerns about migration, especially if migration is disorderly, poorly managed, and uncontrolled. But these concerns should not be allowed to fall into expressions of racism and xenophobia towards the migrants themselves. We have a responsibility not to exacerbate prejudices and tensions with misleading information and biased terminology, including through our use of social media. And let me provide you with a specific example on this question of the use of language. We often hear and see used the term illegal, used to refer to migrants themselves, as in illegal migrants, which of course purports to reflect their legal status, but in reality is unduly pejorative and serves to obscure the large variety of reasons why a person may be in a situation of irregularity. It tends to inflate the seriousness of the cause of the irregularity, suggesting, in fact, some criminal activity, when in fact the irregular situation may simply arise from a violation of the terms and conditions of a visa. Similarly, disaster imagery to describe migration with words such as swarms, invasions, floods, and hordes, often, even when they're at times innocently used, all serve to pollute the public debate and public opinion and eventually lead to insurmountable stereotyping. Dear colleagues, let me conclude with this note of progress. The consultations and negotiations that have taken place here in New York in the past 18 months, leading to the adoption of the text of the Global Compact this summer, in my view, have been conducted in a serious, sober, and respectful atmosphere, and have, as a consequence, in my view, led to a broader acceptance of policy options that were not necessarily obvious at the outset of this process. For instance, when the Secretary General's report that is entitled Making Migration Work for All was published last January, it recommended that one way, not the only way, but one way to address irregular migration route is through the creation of a variety of legal pathways. That, I think is fair to say, was met with considerable skepticism in the views of some and was somewhat controversial. In the same way, suggestions in the Secretary General's report that responses to the situation of the irregular migrants should always be addressed on a spectrum of options that could include regularization options. That was also resisted by many. But as the negotiations for the Global Compact progressed and that actually concluded, I think we're seeing more and more member states willing to explore a variety of initiatives to develop migration policies that are demonstrably effective, rooted in evidence and in experience, and likely to foster a healthier climate for the eventual reception and integration of migrants in host communities. The adoption of the Global Compact for Safe, Orderly, and Regular Migration that will take place this December in Marrakesh will be a seminal moment for global policymaking on migration. So as the Global Compact is adopted, we need more than ever before, I think, in this process, an accurate portrayal of migrants, an accurate portrayal of migration to help shape public discourse and lead to appropriate policies. it's up to all of us, governments, policymakers, the UN system, civil society, academia, the private sector, media, migrants, and host communities to engage responsibly and accurately in making migration work for all. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Ms. Arbour. Enlightening, thank you again. Pointing out what is in fact in the Compact too, as Objective 17, where the issue of perception and the issue of reporting is being addressed, and setting objectives and how to get there. So we're looking forward for these inspirations in coming months and years in trying to change these narratives. I would like now that perhaps we could have a view from the South and from our other host, Minister Jhinaoui from the Republic of Tunisia, who I believe would like perhaps some introductory words before we move on to the panel. Mr. Jhinaoui.
Thank you very much, Mr. Moderator. Excellencies, distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen. Let me start by expressing my gratitude to my Maltese friend and colleague, His Excellency Mr. Carmelo Abela, the European Union, France, and the ICMPD for organizing this side event, and by thanking all these distinguished panelists taking part in this panel. From my perspective, the facts about migration have to do with history, geography, economy, and perhaps more importantly, responsibility. History, because everyone in this room can cite an example of an imminent or more migrants who made history in his recipient country. Geography, since it is very hard to cite any migrant-free country. Economy, because there is an abundant literature on the contribution of migrants both to their countries of adoption and their countries of origin, as it was said earlier by Madame Arbour. Finally, migration has to do with responsibility. As we live in an interdependent and connected village in which industrialized countries have a double responsibility towards the population in need in the developing world and towards their own populations. I believe that politicians in our countries, both in power and in the opposition, should have the courage to maintain these facts in their minds, particularly when they are speaking to the public opinion. For us, migratory phenomena is something permanent and determinant of the world, in particular in the Mediterranean region, which has always symbolized strategic and vital crossroad for world exchange of all types. Unfortunately, the current international situation, characterized, among other things, by the upsurge of conflict, the spreading out of poverty, and the exacerbation of disparities within countries and between countries, has made of the Mediterranean a scene of countless human tragedies. Despite the very difficult national transitional context which Tunisia is living, and particularly despite of the geostrategic situation where we are, Tunisia raised up to its responsibility and hosted in 2011 in a dignified manner more than 1.2 million Libyan and foreign refugees, almost 10% of its own population. It was as if Europe received 50 million migrants in a few weeks. Proportionality is a key notion here for government and the media. Till today, my country is home for 2,000 of foreign nationals, Libyan, Syrians, and Sub-Saharan African, who fled the chaos in their respective countries. These refugees and migrants live in Tunisia in full respect of their human rights, and they are well integrated within the Tunisian social setup and enjoying all the benefit which Tunisian citizens enjoy from the state. government institutions and Tunisian civil society, with the support of international organizations, in particular IOM, UNHCR, ICRC, the ICMPD, and our partners and friends are today working together to further strengthen the protection of the rights of migrants in Tunisia. In addition, a law on preventing and combating human trafficking was adopted in August 2016. This law is a landmark step in our effort to cater with all aspects of this issue. Globally, and as we prepare to adopt the Global Compact for Safe, Orderly and Regular Migration, le Pacte Mondial sur la Migration, we believe that it is time for all components of the international community to combine efforts so as to better manage the scourge of irregular migration, better answer the people's aspiration, and preserve all human beings' dignity. Though not binding, the Global Compact will, we hope, set in motion a global and genuine cooperation on migration based on empirical data and on the principle of shared but differentiated responsibility. A cooperation that addresses the structural cause of poverty, which leads to irregular migration, strengthens the channels for regular migration, and promotes integration of migrants in host countries. A cooperation that facilitates financial transfers, strengthens the fight against trafficking from both sides, from the south countries, but also from the north, and various forms of discrimination, and facilitate the safe return and readmission. My country is working hard to discourage its nationals to migrate illegally. In the same context, we are working with our European partners to implement a true mobility partnership, and we are in a phase, a quite advanced phase, in negotiating that kind of new partnership focused on an interdependence between the concerted management of legal migration and the fight against irregular one. We have already concluded a number of agreements with our partners on regular immigration, and we are aiming to develop new win-win concepts for organized and regulated migration, responding to the needs of our European partners in human and workforces and contributing to the development of the region, providing migrants. In the same time, regarding the admission of third countries nationals, including those rescued at sea, Tunisia has always respected and will continue to respect all its international obligations and commitment emanating from the pertinent convention it has already ratified. Mr. Moderator, let me close by stating the obvious. Young people across the world are risking their lives in desert and seas because of conflict and because of poverty. A straightforward solution cannot stem from something other than our commitment and tangible work to resolving pending conflict, particularly in Africa, in Libya next door, preventing new ones, building peace and institutions in war-torn and post-conflict countries, and mobilizing all resources for sustainable and comprehensive development around the world. And thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you, Minister Jhinaoui, for highlighting the responsibilities upheld by Tunisia in also welcoming large numbers of migrants, but also refugees. The opportunities that have been underlined in the three first introductory speeches are very important in bringing us towards potential positive narratives on migrations, which are often forgotten about. I would like now to hear the views of France on how these narratives are impacting on the shaping of policies that will address the issue of migration, and then we'll move on to an open discussion with our panelists. So I'll give you a word to Alexis Lamek, who is Director for United Nations and International Organizations, Human Rights and Francophonie from the French Republic in New York.
Merci beaucoup.
Thank you very much, Minister, Madam the Special Representative. Indeed, we have to make sure that we don't have, simplistic narratives about migration. Today, we notice an increasing trend to focus on the negative aspect, and that regard the European continent is not, it's not alone. It's also an example, and we have this declaration which are fantasy. We have now to present a speech and a narrative that is based on data, on facts, and migration, when it's properly managed, can contribute positively to the development and the wealth of society. And I think the Special Representative, you've demonstrated, spectacularly well, how it can be done. 25% of the French people, can find their origin in another country. And it is in that perspective that the French, through the French Development Agency, action of civil society that promote narrative that is promoting the qualities of the migrants. At the national level, France has also adopted an action plan for international migration and development. And in that plan, we have a strategic objective which consists in the promotion of a responsible narrative through the valorization of the contribution of migrants to development. So now those who would like to, change our values, based on fears, we have to remind them of one thing: migrants are people, and they have their dignity. They're entitled to dignity. They're entitled to their rights, and those rights and their dignity should be protected in all circumstances, with no exception. At the same time, we would be naive to, not talk about the negative consequences of the uncontrolled migration. We see that in the media every day. All these people who die in the oceans, in the deserts, and also we see many migrants who are exposed to the violation of their rights in Libya or elsewhere. The difficulties of migration are in a completely different order. The challenges that are, that host societies are facing. They're not necessarily prepared to, for this strong influx of migrants, and they don't necessarily have the resources to integrate them very well. At the same time, we have to be very so we have to stay away from the speeches of fear. You will also have to stay away from people who are naive. The French president doesn't believe the conditional opening of all borders, but he doesn't believe in policies based on wars. In fact, we have we concentrate our efforts on to limit the negative aspects of disorganized migration. We have this adversity that France with its partners is working with on a constitution to coordinate everything between host countries and transit countries, and welcome and to around the Mediterranean basin. In this context, and facing contexts that are based on the exclusive and subjective representations, the promotion of a speech that is based on objective vision and documented vision, a balanced vision of migration is needed. In the Global Pact, migration, which will be adopted in Marrakesh in December, and which France supports, can contribute and can be a very positive factor, because among the goals of the Global Compact, Goal 17, the promotion of speech based on facts, on data, that is very important to change the public perception of migration. So to build a positive narrative on migration, all those who are participating to the public debate, experts, media, and politicians have a responsibility. We have to have a calm, and serene public debate about that. That's a necessary condition so that the deciders, can, propose, a reasonable argumentation, when faced with xenophobia or alarmist, narratives. This. Now, to make that possible, we need to understand better the migration phenomenon by, getting more data about it and sharing this data about migration. We also, share better our information, about migration by educating better our people, and especially the youth, and France in that aspect, that the very first goal of the Global Pact, migration is dedicated to that issue, the issue of education, the international or global platform for knowledge, the global knowledge platform in the pact, provides, for sharing of all this useful information about migration. So that in conclusion, I would like to underscore one more time that to have a balanced narrative, be heard by our citizens. It's very important to improve tremendously the international governance of migration, flows, because as long as migrants will be victims of violation of their rights, and as long as we don't, tackle the root cause of migration, and as long as, challenges, as long as, migration won't be controlled and won't be managed in a responsible fashion, the, narrative that, put the emphasis on negative aspects, will be dominant, and it will be difficult to listen to something else. France is convinced that the implementation of the Global Pact for Migration in a sure, orderly and regular fashion will be positive for migration and will help, to fight against these unbalanced narratives. Thank you, Mr. Lamek, to remind us, of all these challenges that we have to work on before we can move towards a new narrative about migration,
And I would like now to have Dr. Spindelegger, as the Director General of the International Center for Migration Policy Development, to detail to us a number of activities, a number of endeavors that have been led both on the policy-making side, but also on the perception-making side. I'm glad to say that with the Thomson Foundation, we associated ourselves with ICMPD to run this Migration Media Award that has been hosted by Malta first, then Tunisia, and that will continue, not to hold the pen of journalists to tell them what to write, but to make sure that they are properly trained, understand the complexity, understand the use of words, as Ms. Arbour has mentioned before. Words can kill. Words need to be accurate. And in this endeavor with ICMPD, we have led a number of activities, of which I'm sure the Director General will mention, including training and Migration Media Award.
Thank you so much, dear Ministers, Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, Madam Arbour, great pleasure to be with you. I would like to start to give you a short example how it is discussed today and how it is different from years before. I was in summer times in the very western part of Austria, in a village with about 250 inhabitants in the Alps. And sitting together in the evening, I asked, what are the main problems? And the answer was migration situation. So I asked, how many migrants do you have in this village? The answer was not a single one. So what is the personal experience of you? Do you have, because of your families, a lot of problems? Answer, no. But it is the big, big problem. So why do people in a small village in the Alps, in the western part of Austria, think about this? Because of what they hear every day in media. And I think this is a very good example you could find in nearly every country in Europe, that people are now very sensible about the issue. And this is different. 10 years ago, we had a big discussion all over the world about the financial crisis situation. But if you would have asked people in this western part of Austria if they are touched by this, they would not have raised this issue. So this is the big difference. Everybody can think about it because of what they hear in media, and they would like, of course, to see solutions. They would like to see action because of this. And if you have a look to media, and they play, I think, the most important role in that, it is not really balanced what you can read and hear every day out of media. It's more black and white. You are very much in favor, or you are totally against the migrants. And there is nearly nothing in between. But the world is not black and white, it is colorful. We all know that. And I think for that, it is really a need to come to a different narrative, to, of course, convince also media that they are looking more to the balanced reporting, looking to this and that side, because otherwise we will separate society more and more, and you will only stand on the one or the other side. And if you don't understand the other side, there will be no solution at the end. So what we created, and I'm very glad that Malta, in the presidency of European Union, was starting with that. We said, why not creating an award for those journalists who are giving a balanced reporting? Let's have a look around the Mediterranean. Which country, what kind of journalists are going to do this balanced reporting? And then let's award them. And there was a big ceremony organized in Valletta, wonderful premises outside. And of course, this was the starting point. And now, Your Excellency, we have been to Tunis to do it for the second time. And I think this is something where you really can give an award to people who try to start with a different narrative, who try to give a perspective that is really more balanced, to look to both sides, and for that also to start with a bridge over these two sides, and to use all these opportunities to become more detailed, focused on facts, and to find a solution for that. So I think this is really needed, but as we all know, also in the upcoming European elections next year, there will be a hot discussion about migration. This will influence a lot of the outcomes in the single countries, and we will see how this European Parliament of the future will be a different one from the past. But anyhow, I think initiatives like that could bring us a step forward, could bring us more to have a balanced narrative and maybe to overcome this black and white situation. I hope that very much, and I thank you all for being so much active in that.
Thank you, Dr. Spindelegger. We've been very talkative yet already, and I'm afraid that Ms. Arbour has to leave us already to meet other commitments. So thank you so much for being with us. Thank you, Dr. Spindelegger. Ignorance breeds fear, and indeed, we've been trying to address that issue with support from the European Commission. Most of our activities in trying to address these narratives have been financed by the Jhinaoui. We have a representative of the Commission here in the person of Antonio Parenti as a principal negotiator for the EU for the Global Compact. And the EU has stressed that both there's a need to have new migration policies, and it's fostering some, or trying to foster a discussion, but there's also a need to support independent journalism and to make sure that independent journalism is better equipped to address this issue of a narrative. So perhaps we could have your views in contribution to this panel discussion. Mr. Parenti.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Thanks, first of all, to the host of this, I think, extremely interesting debate. It's a very timely debate. And I heard a lot of very interesting and pointed intervention this morning. And I think they are all extremely clear on one point. Data is incontrovertible. The short term may be complicated, but the long term is clear. There is a benefit from migration. But I mean, if you look at personal experience, and you look at your own country, I think you're all aware that data is not what changes art. It's difficult to have a debate, a political debate about data. And the problem is not so much the data or the reality. The problem is the perception of the reality. I was on a conference a few days ago, and a minister was telling, it was a finance minister, someone who also had problems in that front, if you want. It's not, the reality of politics today is not whether you are right or wrong, it's whether you are perceived to be right or wrong. So how do we change perception on migration? Because we know the data now. And I think this is not an easy task. I mean, these days, public opinions are formed often on social media. So even a step away sometimes from journalism. But not a distant step. Journalists are still an important part of what is being discussed in social media. Look at any debate today, and you can see that very often there's a reference to journalistic sources. So journalists have, I think, an incredible duty these days. They have a duty to push, fuel, and support the right debate, ask the right questions, pretend the right answers. And let's take it back to migration. The debate in Europe, for example, I'm sorry talking about Europe, but being a European is easy for me. The debate about Europe is how to stem migration. But we don't have a problem of stemming migration. Migration, to a large extent, has been stemmed in Europe. We are down to the thousands these years, up from, or down from the tenth of thousand to the hundredth of thousand of migrants. The problem now is about integrating migrants. But the debate is not about to integrate. It's difficult to find stories in the media, reported in social media, on how to integrate migrants. So a plea for journalists is indeed these, to keep on fueling the right type of debate. Of course, journalists cannot do it alone. They need politicians. They need responsible politicians to look at the long term, which is a difficult side, and I'm here in company of politicians, so I think you are right in understanding it is a difficult debate because you have to come to election on a regular basis. But the long-term solution has to be one of facilitating a discourse which is data-based, which is in the long-term interest of a country. And I think the politicians in this case deserve at least a little bit of a kudos for having facilitated the conclusion of the Global Compact of Migration. This is a very important step. I've been honored to represent, together with many other colleagues, part of the European Union in those negotiations. And I think that together with our African friends, our Arab friends, we managed to find a document which has the correct balance of forward-looking, but also of managing the floods of migrations, managing migration to make it responsible, real, and advantageous for everyone. So I think if we all go in the right direction, and the European Union has been clearly in support of all of this, including by supporting this type of initiative, I think we can try to turn the perception and arrive at the result we all need, which is to have the perception matching the reality. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Parenti. Indeed, perception is a complex phenomenon, probably as complex as migration. For instance, few of us know that Europe is a continent that probably has more nationals living in other continents than any others. We have more European migrants, but they're called expats, living outside Europe, than any other continent has its own nationals living outside. And that's a fact which is not so often well perceived or known. So perception of reality is really a challenge. And it can become a burning issue. And I think, Francesco, Rocca, you come from a country where it has become a burning issue. And we would like to hear from you both as president of the Italy Red Cross, but also as president of the International Federation of Red Cross and Red Crescent Societies. How do you see, what are the narratives in your country and what you've seen also with your experience all over the world as president of the International Federation? Which are these narratives that are constraining politicians and policies?
Microphone, please.
Yes, you are very right. In Italy, we can testify how rapidly shift the mood of the civil society in dealing with the migration. The perception of the impact in the daily life of a country, again, only about perception. How important is how the politicians has fed this perception. Because sometimes this I would like maybe to underline something that, because you stated several times about the media responsibility, which of course is very important. But then, coming from the experience of my country, the journalists most of the time reported what they have listened from the politicians. Nothing less, nothing more. And this has fed this shift of the mood in the civil society. And we are confronting and defending, we feel that we are really in the front line on defending the very essence of the humanitarianism in this moment in Italy and in other countries of Europe. Because when you are defending or standing up for the dignity of the human being, you are immediately perceived as politicized. Neutrality, which has distinguished always the NGOs, the role of the humanitarians in the field, now is criticized. You are taking side if you defend or try to protect the dignity and the life. And the perception, I always use an example in the discussion that the discussions that we have in Italy, but not only in Italy, all over the world. But this is so important in this moment in Italy and in Europe. No one is questioning the role of the firefighters when he arrives to save lives in a building in fire. While it has been criminalized, the role of the NGOs saving lives in the Mediterranean. This is the shift, the best example of perception. And in this, maybe we can add that there has been maybe a responsibility of the media too. A responsibility of the media too, not only of the politicians. Because again, talking about facts, number, and the increasing number of deaths, this is, again, matter of fact, not matter of perception. But unfortunately, this is what we are facing. But there are also good examples that we should maybe underline and create maybe better conditions to be known. I would like maybe to give you an example about an hosting center of the Italian Red Cross in Settimo Torinese, a little city close to Turin, 50,000 inhabitants. And through our hosting centers in 3 years passed more than 42,000 asylum seekers. And with the brilliant leadership of the municipality and of my colleagues of the Italian Red Cross working in the hosting center, we work side by side with the community without any accident, without any episode of xenophobia. Think about 42,000 people in transit in a so little town. This is because we started to work in the school, to work in the neighborhood, presenting the case, talking about the people as a human beings, mother, father, sister, daughters, and their background, their story, what they have left, and why they have decided, or why they have forced to flee their own country. And this has been something that has been a successful experience, as also the other one in Riace, which is maybe is not so well known, but Riace is a little town in Calabria. Few years ago, it was a dying village. It was dying, and many of its houses in disrepair. And this school close to closing down. And this started to change when a little boat of Kurdish refugees became stranded on a nearby beach. Since then, the town has welcomed some 450 migrants, which is not a big number, but very big for that little village. And migrants now make up 1/4 of the population. They were offered housing and training, and have helped to rebuild both the town's population and economy. And I could give you a lot of this kind of example of good integration. So the problem is when we will be able to stop this narrative using good example. I welcome the media award because this is something maybe we should have also something also to say, to blame, because we know perfectly which are the newspaper, which are the media that are using this kind of toxic narrative on a daily basis, feeding this. In Italy, we had a lot of experiences. There was a TV program every night at 7:30 p.m., starting and feeding with episodes of crimes of the migrants. So, I would also, I had a lot of good example of inclusion story made by the British Red Cross, Canadian Red Cross, about the importance of the local actors and the interaction with the municipalities, with the mayors of the city, which can play a key role more than the national politicians. The key is in the community. Key for inclusion is in our daily life. Key for the inclusion is in our schools, is where the young people live. And also we have a lot of good examples in how we are sharing stories of life of people struggling for survive. And this is, has been successful. We as Red Cross, we are committed to increase our role in the community, to sensitize about the life of those who have fled their own country. And again, I don't want to steal so much time, but I want to really thank you for the opportunity to be part of this important panel. Thank you again, and best wishes for the incoming media awards in Tunisia. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Rocca. Thank you for highlighting how polarized perception can be, at the same time giving good examples. And I can tell you that as a member of the jury of the Migration Media Award with my colleague journalists, we've seen many of these incredibly positive stories from your country, Bangladeshi migrants having settled in Palermo, fighting the mafia, refusing to pay racket money. And that lady, which we helped mentor and supported in an endeavor to produce more stories on migration, earned the first prize this year on a wonderful story humanizing the public authorities, the police, and the work they're doing in trying to bring back a dignity to migrants, which is not something we hear so often. We tend to hear more inflammatory comments. I would like to give the floor to all of you here present in the room, just raising your hands should you have a comment or questions, and continue this discussion in a more open and informal way. So please raise your hand should you have any questions. Yes, we have one at the corner here. Please, if you could quickly introduce yourself.
And thank you very much for that very stimulating, interesting discussion. Just a couple of points and then a question at the end. First, as some of the speakers have said, if there was universal consensus on anything in the Global Compact, it was on the importance of data. I think what has also emerged from many of the speakers is that there is, in fact, a lot of data out there. Most of you are familiar with IOM's own data portal that's based in Berlin. So the question really becomes, how do you effectively communicate it? And I don't think that question is, how do you persuade the unpersuadable, because none of us in this room can probably do that. A big focus here on the media, which we would agree certainly is extremely important. However, a distinction has been raised. I think Mr. Parenti in particular pointed out the prevalence of social media. There is mainstream journalism that's reporting on these things, and there's social media, which can be very, very different. The speed with which information, or let's say opinions, moves around the world by means of social media is really striking these days. But that is not journalism. That is not journalism. I think, and some of the speakers touched on this too, while media is indeed very important, responsible journalists are reporting on what's out there. Certainly national leaders and those of us in international organizations and in the UN cannot I think, cede our own responsibility to journalists. We have public affairs teams, all of us, and the responsibility, the shared responsibility that is reflected in the Global Compact means that that the responsibility is to reach out proactively to journalists and make sure they get the story right. That, I think, is all of our collective responsibility, not to downplay the challenges, as the SRSG said very well, not to make it rosy, as she has said in the past, but to put out a clear picture ourselves. On the social media side, you know, to see incorrect or xenophobic tweets, respond to them. Now, that could be the full-time job of a 10,000-person public affairs office, and none of us have that. But we can try and do our best and certainly reach out to the mainstream journalists to correct this. I want to underscore one final thing, because IOM has seen this in all parts of the world, and that is what Mr. Rocca said about the community level. That is where change agents reside. When people get to know their neighbors, when kids play with the kids of newcomers, go to school together, that is where change can be made, and where these narratives can spring up, sort of from a wellspring of where migrants live on the ground. We in the global community are maybe not so close to that, but can certainly set the moral tone. And with that, I thank you very much.
Thank you so much. Indeed, on your last point, ICMPD has commissioned a study from the Office of Public Attitudes to Migration, which has pointed out something that we heard from the panelists here, that neighboring communities are more afraid. The level of threat, of sense of threat, is stronger than within the host communities where migrants live and are usually very well integrated. So this issue of ignorance brings us back to the role of media. You mentioned social media. They do contribute today to an unseen level ever before to the public information debate. And indeed, it raises new challenges. In our project, in our program, we have focused on legacy media, on media outlets, on professional journalists using technique rather than just having a press card. And that technique of checking your information, checking your fact, validating the sources does not exist in social media, and that raises challenges indeed. Anyone else would like to make a comment and raise a question perhaps to panelists here? I think, Suzanne, you mentioned that you had a question at the end and we didn't hear it, or maybe I missed it.
The question did have to do with the question of local communities and integration at that very municipal small level, like the small village in the Alps. And I wanted to ask the panelists if in their projects or their own communities, you know, what has been done in that regard and what they have seen. Thank you.
So has there been initiatives to take into account success stories, grassroots community level initiatives that would be raised to an attention at the national level? Would you, any of you would like to answer to that issue, to that question? Yes, Minister Abela.
Well, thank you very much. I think that integration is crucial in this respect, because as also Mr. Rocca mentioned, when you have positive experiences, it's more than talk itself. I mean, it's not preaching, but actually you're saying what is happening on the ground. We in Malta we have, or rather published, which is there is a document on integration, which is up for consultation. This document does not only talk about integrating migrants. I think at times, if we talk on integration and only focusing on the issue of migrants, we might have stereotypes in this area as well. So integration is dealt with in a broad manner, not only when it comes to migrants. It can be also other minorities, irrespective of what is the issue. So I think it is important to work on the integration. We know of experiences, for example, at school level, children do not distinguish whether the child sitting next to them comes from a neighborhood village or from another country. Children don't have these issues at mind, in their mind. So I think they can teach us how to integrate better than adults, because we do have different perceptions of and past judgments on this. So I think there are these positive examples which need to be made known to others, rather than only discussing, but having this positive narrative. And this is the scope of, or at least partially it is the scope of this meeting here today, that together with the difficulties, with the challenges that we have, but to present also the positive narrative, the examples that are really happening at the moment.
A positive narrative does not mean that we hold the hand of a journalist hiding under the carpet everything negative, difficult, but pointing it out in a balanced way. And we've awarded a first prize radio in Arabic this year, the Migration Media Award, to an incredible story from Radio Tatawin in your country, Minister from Tunisia, Minister Jhinaoui, a wonderful work of how the local community welcome the migrants that have crossed the deserts and find a potential first assistance. You mentioned that Tunisia was doing its duty, and it is doing a tremendous duty in shaping these new policies that you had. Recently, we mentioned the law on human trafficking being adopted in Tunisia. How do you cope with these perceptions, these comments from the media? Freedom of press is now fully supported in Tunisia, and you've been setting an example there too. So how do you cope with these two potentially conflicting perceptions and conflicting phenomena?
Je voudrais revenir à l'exemple.
I would like to go back to the example of Tunisia in 2011. We welcome more than 1 million refugees in 2011. I mentioned it, and most of them, as you mentioned, most of those migrants coming from Libya were integrated in a natural way. There was no problem. The local population welcomed them. They've been accepted by families. Their children were schooled. They've been schooled, you know, and they stayed almost 2 years in the southern part of our country, and they weren't schooled. You know, they could come into hospitals in Tunisia. They were welcomed, and I think the international community did not really watch and did not hear much about this million of refugees and migrants came through Tunisia. For 1 year, we hosted them and we managed them thanks to the support of several international organizations. But you know, they didn't make the news, you know, and that's too sad. But there was a natural, you know, willingness from the Tunisian people to help them and to treat them properly. But I would like, you know, mention another issue, if you don't mind. The issue of the migration is an issue that is going to last. It's not going to go away. It's not something that's going to disappear overnight, you know, like that. So instead of being so focused and maybe obsessed about the consequences of this, you know, about or to be obsessed with the migration, I think we should, you know, talk more about the causes, the root causes of migration, and these causes are clear. In Africa, we have countries, we have states that are, you know, suffering from tremendous insecurity and the lack of good governance. And therefore, our European friends, our Western world friends, you should help those African countries to solve their conflicts and possibly to build institutions that can help them manage the matters of their countries. You know. Secondly, we focus on two phenomena: migration and terrorism. You know, people talk a lot about that. You know, this is important. It's key, sure. But look at Libya, for example. It's a textbook case, you know, Libya. Our European friends, and I have one of them next to me right here, you know, they focus on migration coming either from Libya or, you know, transiting, going through Libya. So, and us, in our dialogues with our friends in Europe, we said, you know, you should make an extra effort to help Libya to solve its problems. If you have a strong state, you know, in Tripoli, country that is able and can manage its borders, you don't need to deploy armies in the Mediterranean Sea to prevent those migration flows coming from the south. Unfortunately, firstly, there's no unanimity in the side of Europe. Europe is divided. You have some European countries, and in fact, with non-European countries, so there's a division in the western side, and they don't see it as an urgency to solve the Libya situation. And that is why we have 500 kilometers of borders with Libya. We believe we're very concerned, and we believe that it's an emergency. And before talking about migration even more, yes, we could talk about the needs of the migrant, but we have to look at the deep root causes of this issue, which are political and military causes.
The need to address the causes, the roots, not only the symptoms. And there's perhaps an initiative that should be mentioned by ACMPD, which is, again, at grassroots level, trying to sensitize municipal authorities in trying to design at their level, because they are facing firsthand the burning issues of housing people, feeding them, looking after them. So please, can you describe this initiative, which is called Migration Cities to Cities, I believe?
Thank you very much. Yeah, just some comments about this. We have made this program now for some years. So big cities, they have all a lot of problems with migration. So to bring them together, to discuss the different issues and to use an exchange and to make a positive experience available to others, this is one of these main issues of the city-to-city program. So there are big cities like Tunis, like Beirut, as well as European cities like Vienna or Italian cities and so on. So they are coming together, talking about the very concrete experience, and then to form a program out of that. I think this is most important, because you don't have to invent the wheel every time. You can also use the experience from others, and then also to start with media experience. I think also this is one of the part of the city-to-city program. So we are very much happy to run this program, and this is also one of the positive examples that we should put on the table today.
We have, thank you, Dr. Spindelegger. We have another 10 minutes together. Any questions in the audience? I would like to come back perhaps to the issue of France and your activities. You mentioned AFD, which is running an important series of programs trying to address these development issues. So perhaps you could tell us a little bit more on the link between addressing the root of the problem, as Minister Jhinaoui underlined, and the issue of migration.
Oui. Merci. No, en effet,
Yes, thank you. I want to thank their speakers, because this debate was very informative and very interesting. And I think it's important to broaden the debate. Indeed, we talked about very clearly about the fact that it was very important to talk about the narrative about migration, the fact that the way it's presented, gives a bad perception. But we have tools for that. And the AFD, the French Development Agency, has a number of tools that are not dedicated just to attack, root causes, but the qualification, of this, that's part of an important part of our activity. So, we FD, we give money for operations outside France. It has, it's local governments, that are in charge of, tackling migration issues in France. So I would like to go back to issue that, that's you, Excellency, you talked about, tackling the root causes. It's a very important issue. Thank you for raising this issue, because it's very important to talk about the symptoms, and the root causes are very key. And the 2 points that you mentioned are very key. In fact, first, the issue of security, and the second, governance. And this is why I think, and these key are totally taken into consideration in the global global compact for migration. And this is the reason why we believe that compact, sends the right messages. In fact, we should talk about shared responsibility for all countries, including origin countries. We need to work all together so that these security issues and governance issues are better taken into account. Regarding the first one of those two, security, regarding, you mentioned Libya, of course that's a priority. The French president has tried to take into account, beyond just, managing the flows of migrants, trying to tackle the issue of the trafficking, and the sanctioning the traffickers, and to condemn them. We want to go beyond that even further, and we want to attack, the core of the issue, which is the political solution, in Libya. As you said, President Macron has already organized 2 meetings in Paris and in near Paris since last year, specifically to support the action of the special representative of the Secretary General of the UN, Mr. Salamé, so that we can find a political solution in Libya. You are absolutely right. It's very important to underscore the fact that the best way to tackle the issue of the migration is that we need to help Libya to have a strong institution. I would even say institutions, period, because that's what it needs at this time, so that it can face this migration issue itself. Libya. Yes, it is a key issue. You're right.
Which is in the last 7 years, the Commission has been supporting the nation building in Tunisia, an institutional set up to the point that now Tunisia is probably the country receiving the strongest EU origin assistance in terms of budgetary assistance, but also project-led activities.
Thank you. Yeah, I think, Minister, you touch upon a fundamental point. It's true. I mean, we have to tackle the root causes of migration. Being aware of a little tweak in all of this, which is by developing countries, most often what we have in the short term is an increase of migration, because people feel more empowered to travel. But this should not be quite the opposite, the excuse not to intervene. Now, I think we should also be aware of the fact that the European Union has put good governance as the core of its own development assistance towards Africa. And we need to build, and we are putting money where our mouth is. I mean, we just launched 1 year ago an investment plan for Africa, which will work with the help of the African countries, with the help of the European industries, to bring money where most is needed, and possibly build up also a better governance in the way. And I think in this sense, we differentiate from other donors in Africa. But it's a long-term, or at least a medium-term job. And I think the same applies to Libya. Any solution to Libya will require a buying in from the local population. And this, in the current circumstances, remains complicated. Hence, I think part of the real focus on the emergencies, but it's not a total focus. It's a focus which goes along with trying to create a better future for the Libyans and the Libyan country.
Thank you. We're reaching shortly the end of our discussion. I wanted to perhaps give the floor again to Minister Abela, who has been welcoming not only the Migration Media Award, but also the EU Support Asylum Office in Malta, and has taken the lead with the Migration Summit that took place during the presidency. Perhaps to do some initial concluding remarks, and then Mr. Jhinaoui could perhaps also add his own comments if need be. Mr. Abela.
Well, first of all, I thank everyone that not only participated, but also is present here for this interesting discussion. We mentioned a number of points. I think that we all know what is the way forward, in the sense that if I recall the Valletta Summit, for example, where we had the meeting in Valletta in 2015, we had a summit between the African leaders and the European leaders, and we agreed on the way forward in the sense that we need to work together. And I think this is crucial, working together, showing solidarity. It's not only a question of changing the narrative or the perception of what's happening. It's good to have data. It's good to know what's happening in reality, not as a matter of perception. But then it boils down to action. So I definitely agree on tackling the root causes. I definitely agree on taking initiatives in host countries, in countries of transit, So definitely there is no one answer to this issue, to managing migration. We have a multitude of things to do at different levels in different countries, regions, and above all, we should do it together. So I think working together is a far better option than trying to either shift the burden on some or on few, rather than taking collective responsibility in this issue. And with this, I conclude, and thank you once again for being here with us. And I hope that we continue to working together for the better of our societies and of our countries. Thank you.
Of course, I mentioned the root causes, but there's another issue, another key issue, which is how do you manage fear? Because this phenomenon is starting to trigger a phenomenon of fear in Europe, which is instrumentalized and used by political forces, and we're facing, where it's a very slippery slope and very dangerous at this stage. And the role of the media is at this, in that sense, very key and very important. It's very important that the message that we talked about this morning must be, talked about, and the European public opinion needs to know that the other is not a danger. It can be, in fact, a source of further wealth, increased wealth, and that's a very key element that could be, key for the future of a number of European countries. Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Minister.
Thank you to our panelists. Thank you for hosting us here at the United Nations, and see you soon. Thank you.